The air in the council cabin was thick with the smell of fear and salt. Before the assembled pirate lords, the widow Zheng Shi stood alone, her husband's blade heavy in her hand. Their eyes held not respect, but hungry ambition. To survive, she would have to make a deal with the devil himself. What she demanded next rewrote history. In the year 1807, the most powerful navy in the South China Sea did not belong to an emperor. It belonged to a former prostitute, a fleet larger than most sovereign nations, 1 to 800 ships, from swift junks to formidable flagships, an army of 80,000 pirates, cutthroats, and outcasts. And at its heart, a commander so ruthless and ingenious, she didn't just break the rules of piracy. She rewrote them. This isn't a legend. It's a case study in power, forged in the crucible of crushing injustice. Our investigation begins not with a ship, but in a brothel. To understand the ascent of Zheng Shi, you must first steep yourself in the viscous, oppressive air of the Pearl River Delta circa 1800. This wasn't just a coastline. It was a raw, pulsing wound of commerce and human traffic. Canton was the sole legal conduit for all of China's trade with the Western world, a bottleneck that concentrated unimaginable wealth alongside staggering depravity. The stench of tea, salt, and silt blended with the heavier odor of desperation. And in the shadow of the great Hong merchant warehouses, in the labyrinthine alleys of floating brothels and waterfront taverns, the economy of flesh thrived as a dark mirror to the trade in porcelain and silver. Here, a young girl named Xu Yang entered the historical record, which is to say, she vanished into its darkest margins. Her precise origins are obscured, deliberately erased by the mechanics of the trade. She was likely from a Tanka family, the boat-dwelling people of the Delta, who were viewed as pariahs by land-bound Chinese society, denied education, legal protections, or social mobility. From birth, her destiny was circumscribed by water and prejudice. Sold or kidnapped, the distinction was academic, she became a commodity in one of Canton's numerous brothels. Her name, Shai, simply meaning stone, hints at a hoped-for durability, or perhaps the cold, transactional value assigned to her. Life inside was a lesson in brutal microeconomics. Her body was not her own. It was inventory. Her time was parceled into coins. Her value was determined by her ability to navigate a clientele spanning drunken Portuguese sailors, homesick Qing officials, and ruthless Cantonese smugglers. This was her university. She learned to assess a man's power, his weaknesses, his dialect, and the glint in his eye, whether it promised fleeting kindness or sudden violence. She learned the art of performance and the science of survival, where a misplaced word could mean a beating, and a clever observation could secure an extra sliver of security. The emotion here is not just anger at the injustice, but a simmering, focused rage at the system's efficient cruelty. It forged in her a diamond-hard pragmatism. Every interaction was a negotiation, every glance a calculation. Meanwhile, on the very waters that brought her clients, another form of commerce thrived: piracy. It wasn't the romantic rebellion of Western fiction, but a complex, bloody ecosystem. Fleets, organized under colored flags, were less like lawless gangs and more like rogue maritime corporations, extorting protection fees from traders and coastal villages. Among the most formidable was the Red Flag Fleet, commanded by a man whose very name struck fear: Zheng Shi. He was no unwashed brute. He was a strategic visionary, part of a powerful pirate dynasty from nearby Xinhu. He didn't just seek plunder. He sought consolidation, building a confederation of pirates through a mix of intimidation, savvy alliance, and sheer force of personality. Their worlds, the floating brothel and the pirate flagship, were parallel tributaries of the same murky river. They likely met in 1801, not in a storm of passion, but in a context of power. Perhaps Zheng Shi, flush with silver, sought entertainment. Perhaps he needed a translator, a discreet ear for the gossip of port. What he encountered in Xiyang was not mere compliance. He saw a person who understood power dynamics instinctively, who spoke the language of transaction without flinching, whose survival depended on reading men more accurately than any of his rough-hewn lieutenants could. For her, he represented the ultimate client, one whose patronage could permanently alter her bargaining position. The marriage proposal was, in all likelihood, a cold-blooded strategic alliance. For Zheng Shi, a woman of her talents was an asset. She could manage intelligence, broker deals with shady port officials, and navigate the social complexities his world of brute force often failed to penetrate. A wife, particularly one from the marginalized Tanka, would be bound to his interests in a way a mere lieutenant was not. For Xiyang, this was the critical pivot. It was an escape hatch from a life of perpetual degradation. But the exit led not to freedom, but to a different, higher-stakes cage. She was trading the tyranny of many masters for the partnership with one. She wasn't being rescued, she was being recruited. The ceremony itself was irrelevant. The transaction was what mattered. She married him, taking the name Zheng Shi, the Zheng Widow. The title, ironically prophetic, immediately granted her a status she could never have claimed alone. But she was not merely a consort. Evidence suggests she was integrated into the structure of power. She moved from the perfumed, confined quarters of the brothel to the bustling, masculine deck of a pirate junk. The salt air now smelled not of decay, but of opportunity. She observed everything, how supply lines were secured, how loyalty was bought and punished, where the Confederation's fragile alliances were strained. She was studying the blueprint of the machine she would one day need to command. This chapter closes not with a wedding feast, but with a silent, monumental shift in perspective. Zheng Shi, the former commodity, now stood beside the source of immense power. She had secured her survival, but her ambition was just beginning to crystallize. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. In a world where everything is a transaction, you must become the architect of the deal, not its currency. The watery world that had once confined her was now the chessboard, and she was learning, move by ruthless move, how to play. The tempest that took Zheng Shi in 1807 was more than a meteorological event. It was a political cataclysm. The news crashed upon the Red Flag Confederation, not with a single wave, but in a corrosive drip of rumor and dread. He was gone, not in a blaze of glorious battle, but swallowed by the indifferent sea, a void where a cornerstone once stood. Aboard the scattered fleet, a cold, familiar calculus immediately began. Power abhors a vacuum, and the South China Sea was a realm defined by its relentless gravitational pull towards chaos. For Zheng Shi, the moment of her husband's death was the stripping away of a fundamental fiction. The title Zheng's Widow was no longer a protective mantle, but a target painted on her back. She stood on the deck of a world that saw her as an accessory, a temporary ornament to power now rusted and disposable. The Confederation was a fragile pact of rival captains. Men like the brutal Guo Podai and the cunning Liang Bao, each commanding their own squadrons, bound to Zheng Yi by a mix of profit, fear, and personal loyalty. With him vanished, those bonds dissolved into a soup of ambition and opportunism. The emotion here is a stark, isolating terror, the kind that freezes the lungs. It was the precipice. To step back was to be pushed, to be consumed, to find herself once again a commodity, now to be divided amongst the victors. But the woman who had learned to read the micro-expressions of clients in a dim brothel could certainly read the macro-expressions of grasping warlords. She did not retreat into mourning theatrics. Instead, she engaged in a silent, rapid audit of her assets. She had not spent 6 years as the commander's wife merely hosting dinners. She had been a keen auditor of his methods, a student of the Confederation's ledger books, a quiet witness to every slight and grudge between his subordinates. She knew who was greedy but cowardly, who was brave but resentful, who was loyal to the idea of the fleet's strength over their own immediate gain. Her most critical asset, however, was a person, Zhang Bao. He was not like the others. A fisherman's son taken captive by Zheng Yi as a boy, he had been raised within the pirate hierarchy, becoming a favored protege and a formidable commander in his own right. His loyalty to the Zheng name was personal, almost filial, and his ambition was tempered by a strategic mind that saw the bigger picture. Zheng Shi moved first and decisively here, securing his allegiance. It was not a romantic alliance, though history would later whisper about it, but a foundational political merger. He provided the essential martial credibility. She possessed the administrative intellect and, crucially, the legitimacy of the Zheng name. Together they formed a nucleus of stability in the swirling chaos. The inevitable Council of Captains was a theater of masked threats. Imagine the scene: the great cabin of a flagship, smoky with lamp oil and tension, the air, thick with the scent of sweat and salt, vibrated with unspoken challenges. The captains assembled, their postures claiming space, their eyes assessing her not as a leader, but as a prize or an obstacle. They expected pleas, perhaps a bid for safe passage ashore in exchange for a portion of the treasury. What they received was a negotiation. Zheng Shi, likely with Zheng Bao, a formidable, silent presence at her shoulder, did not appeal to their mercy. She spoke the only language they truly respected, that of profit and power. She presented herself not as a widow seeking shelter, but as the sole repository of the Confederation's institutional knowledge. The complex web of tributary villages, the secret agreements with corrupt port officials, the schedules of merchant vessels, the hidden coves and freshwater sources. She was the living database of the enterprise. To fragment the fleet, she argued, was to make them all vulnerable, to turn them from a terrifying nation into squabbling, huntable gangs. The Qing authorities would pick them off one by one. She proposed continuity. She offered a vision of consolidated, even expanded wealth under a unified command. But she backed this vision with a stark, unspoken threat embodied in her alliance with Zhang Bao and his loyalists. Any move to splinter the Confederation would not result in a clean break, but in immediate internal war. She forced upon them a chilling cost-benefit analysis. The path of least resistance, the most profitable and safest course, was not to overthrow her, but to accept her. It was a masterstroke of realpolitik. She made her election as fleet commander seem not like a concession to a woman, but the only rational business decision for men who wanted to survive and get rich. The moment the grudging acclamation was given, a tense muttered consensus rather than a cheer, the world shifted. Zheng Shi had crossed the unimaginable gulf. She had leveraged every bitter lesson from her past, every iota of intelligence gathered in the brothel and the captain's cabin, to perform the ultimate alchemy. She transformed her perceived weakness, her gender, her widowhood, into the very instruments of control. She had not been given power. She had seized it through an act of profound psychological understanding, convincing a cabal of hardened pirates that their survival was inextricably linked to her command. The terror of the precipice was now replaced by the sheer, vertiginous weight of the crown she had just claimed. The Gambit was over. The far more dangerous game of rule had begun. The acclamation of the captains was a fleeting victory. Zheng Shi now stood atop a pyramid of knives, each point pressed against the belly of the man below. Her real challenge began not on the open sea, but in the dank, crowded holds of her own fleet. Here, amidst the stink of bilge water, unwashed bodies, and simmering discontent, she had to transmute a volatile coalition of competing interests into a single unstoppable instrument. She understood that raw fear could command obedience, but only a system could engineer loyalty. What she crafted in the months following her ascension was nothing short of a revolutionary social contract, a bureaucratic framework for barbarity that would become her true legacy. The genius of her code, often called the Articles of the Red Banner, lay in its cold, corrective logic. It surgically addressed the very ailments that doomed most pirate ventures: chaotic greed, internal mistrust, and wasteful cruelty. Her first decree established a fundamental reorientation of their relationship with the coast. Villages that supplied the fleet with food, intelligence, and safe harbor were granted formal protection. Raiding them was punishable by death. This was not born of sentiment, but of profound strategic foresight. She turned potential victims into stakeholders, creating a sprawling, unofficial coastal infrastructure that fed her intelligence network and denied the same to the Qing authorities. The sea nomads and poor fishermen, often oppressed by the very empire that disdained them, found a more reliable, if fearsome, patron in Madame Zheng. But the heart of her system, its most staggering innovation, was its economic architecture. All plunder was no longer a free-for-all. Upon returning from a raid, every scrap of silk, every ingot of silver, every captured piece of naval artillery was presented to a designated fleet treasurer. This was a radical departure from tradition. The treasure was meticulously catalogued, a bureaucratic ritual in the midst of the bloody carnival. 20% of the total was siphoned off into a common fund. This fund was the lifeblood of her corporate state. From it, she administered what can only be called a pirate welfare system. A sailor wounded in action would be compensated from the fund. A broken arm might net a small silver sum, the loss of a limb a much larger one. This was a cold, calculated investment in morale. It answered the desperate question every fighter harbored: what happens to me when I am no longer useful? She provided an answer, ensuring that a wounded man would not face destitution, and thus had less incentive to desert or turn mutinous at the first sign of trouble. It bound the men's futures irrevocably to the fleet's continued success. Her discipline was legendary, and its severity was the steel frame upon which this welfare state was built. The articles were read aloud regularly, a grim liturgy. Disobedience of an order during battle meant beheading. The unauthorized absence from one's ship meant a brutal lashing. But her most famous and telling prohibitions targeted behaviors that weakened the social and operational fabric. Theft from the collective treasury, death, desertion, death. These were standard. Her unique touch lay in her regulation of personal conduct. Rape of female prisoners was a capital offense. She enforced this with terrifying consistency. In a world where women captives were considered inevitable spoils of war, this edict was revolutionary. It served multiple purposes. It prevented the kind of distracting, violent squabbles that could erupt over prisoners. It maintained a facade of discipline that made negotiations with certain merchants and officials possible. And on a deeply personal level, it drew a stark line between the anarchic predation of her past and the controlled, strategic violence of her present empire. Furthermore, she instituted a form of prohibition. No crewman was allowed to go ashore without express permission. And crucially, the holds of her ships were to be free of alcohol, especially during expeditions. A drunken crew was a vulnerable crew. She traded the temporary solace of rum for the permanent advantage of alertness. This was not a democracy, but it was a startlingly transparent meritocracy within its iron framework. Leadership positions on captured vessels were awarded based on proven performance and loyalty, not mere seniority or brute strength. This incentivized ambition within the channels she approved. She created, in effect, a parallel society with its own brutal justice, its own social safety net, and its own career ladder. The fleet morphed from a gathering of pirates into a nomadic city-state, a floating Sparta governed by a prophet of order. The men, many of whom had been pressed into service from the lowest rungs of a society that offered them nothing, now lived under a code that was harsh but clear, cruel but predictable. They were invested in the system, literally and figuratively. Their survival and their profit were systematized. In the damp, rolling world of a wooden ship, Zheng Shi had engineered the most unexpected of things. A society that, for all its violence directed outward, possessed a perverse internal stability. She had taken the chaos of the South China Sea and imposed upon it her own devastating grammar. The celestial mandate of the Qing Emperor, forged in northern horsemanship and Confucian orthodoxy, proved brittle against the salt-stained reality of the southern sea. Reports filtering into the Forbidden City were not mere dispatches. They were chronicles of a profound humiliation. A woman, a former prostitute from a pariah class, was not just evading their justice, she was instituting her own. She levied taxes on the imperial rice and spice routes. She administered territory from her decks. Her judges passed sentences, her treasurers minted value, all while flying the blood-red banner of her own sovereignty. This was not piracy, it was secession. And so, the lumbering might of the empire, a dragon more accustomed to ruling the land, was forced to look to the water. Their initial responses were textbook and utterly ineffectual. Provincial admirals, steeped in the patronage politics of the Qing court rather than the nuances of tidal warfare, would sortie with impressive top-heavy junks. They sought the decisive, set-piece battle that defined imperial warfare. But Zheng Shi's navy was a phantom. It dissolved into the maze of island archipelagos, the hidden river estuaries, known intimately only to the tanka pilots she employed. Her ships were leaner, faster, and unburdened by bureaucratic indecision. When the imperial fleet did engage, the result was often calamity. Her commanders, like Zhang Bao, fought with the desperate ingenuity of those defending their only home. They used fire ships, derelict vessels packed with saltpeter and pitch, set adrift into the heart of rigid Qing formations. They attacked at night, in the squalling blindness of seasonal rains, or lured proud admirals onto sandbars whose shifting geography was absent from imperial charts. The Empire's frustration curdled into a broader, more brutal strategy. If they could not catch the dragon, they would drain the sea. Officials imposed a devastating coastal embargo, seeking to starve the pirates by severing their connection to the mainland. Villages were forcibly evacuated, fishing junks burned, and entire stretches of shoreline were declared kill zones. This scorched earth policy was a testament to their desperation, and it backfired spectacularly. It did not starve Zheng Shi. It delivered unto her a legion of new recruits. The fishermen, salt farmers, and merchants whose livelihoods were literally torched by their own government had little left to lose. They brought their boats, their knowledge of hidden coves and freshwater springs, and their seething hatred for the Qing straight into the arms of the Pirate Confederation. Each imperial atrocity was her most effective recruiting sergeant, transforming her from a predator on the coast into its perverse protector. Her intelligence apparatus became the true marvel, a nervous system far more responsive than the Empire's. Every protected village, every smuggler paid in silver, every corrupted local magistrate formed a node in this network. A Qing fleet could not leave port without her knowing its composition, its route, and often the name of its commander. Messages flew on, fast, single-sailed cutters, outpacing official couriers. This allowed her to perform acts of strategic teleportation, concentrating her forces where the enemy was weakest, vanishing from where they were strong. She mastered not just battle, but the art of strategic presence, appearing with overwhelming force to crush isolated detachments before melting away again. European observers, primarily Portuguese and British traders, forced to pay her hefty protection fees, watched this contest with a mixture of horror and professional admiration. In their letters and reports, they documented not a wild mob, but a phenomenon. They noted the grim efficiency of her port inspections, the crisp execution of her coded flag signals across vast distances, and the chilling discipline of her crews. To these representatives of emerging colonial powers, she presented a stark truth. Here was a state, however unorthodox, that controlled the waterways upon which their commerce depended. They negotiated with her harbor masters, as they would with a foreign minister, however reluctantly. This external grudging recognition further eroded the Qing's claim to exclusive dominion. The human cost of the Empire's failure was staggering. Provincial treasuries were bled dry funding futile campaigns. Promising military careers foundered on the rocks of her defenses. The social fabric of the southern coastline was torn asunder, not by her raids, but by the imperial attempt to quarantine her. And through it all, the Red Flag fleet grew fatter, stronger, and more embedded. The Qing dragon had thrashed its tail, sent tidal waves of soldiers and silver southward, and succeeded only in proving the resilience of Madame Zheng's creation. The message was etched in sunken imperial hulls and smoldering coastal outposts. They could not win a war fought on her terms. This crushing, expensive stalemate became the fertile ground for a more dangerous thought to take root in the halls of power. If annihilation was impossible, then another, more distasteful solution must be considered. The stage was being set not for a final battle, but for an unprecedented negotiation, born not from strength, but from the Empire's exhausted, humiliating realization of its own limits. The greatest threat to Zheng Shi's empire would never emerge from the cannons of a Qing warship. It grew silently, like rot in the hold, born from the very source of her strength, the impeccable, inhuman order of her system. For years, her constitution had suppressed the chaotic human desires of 80,000 souls, bending them to a single collective will. But desire is a hydraulic force. Suppressed in one area, it seeks outlet in another. The tension began to manifest not in open rebellion, but in a slow, corrosive seepage of ambition, envy, and the innate craving for autonomy. At the epicenter of this growing pressure was Zhang Bao. The once loyal protege had matured into a legendary admiral in his own right, the glittering sword of the Confederation. His name was sung in taverns from Macau to Fujian. To the men he was the victorious general, the face of their prowess, the one who shared their hardships on the deck. Zheng Shi, by necessary contrast, was the distant CEO, the architect of rules and percentages, her authority exercised through intermediaries and scrolls. A subtle organic division of prestige began to emerge. Zhang Bao commanded fervent loyalty. Zheng Shi commanded institutional obedience. This duality worked brilliantly until the human element intervened. The nature of their personal bond is the great ghost in the machine of their history. Western observers and Qing chroniclers referred to him as her foster son, and later her husband. The truth is likely a strategic ambiguity she herself cultivated. What is evident, however, is that their relationship became the fault line upon which the politics of the fleet trembled. Zhang Bao, surrounded by sycophants and warriors who credited him directly for their wealth, may have begun to chafe under the ultimate authority of the woman in the flagship cabin. Was the fleet's wealth his to distribute? Were his battle-hardened veterans truly subject to the same draconian penalties for minor infractions? The code that created stability now felt, to his growing faction, like a harness. This tension was exacerbated by the fleet's staggering success. With the Qing Navy in disarray, the easy pickings were gone. The Confederation now faced harder targets and longer voyages. The rigid 80-20 split of plunder, once a guarantee of fairness, now felt to some like a steep tax for administrative services they no longer appreciated. Veteran captains, their personal chests heavy with silver, began to dream of a quieter, autonomous dominion over a single stretch of coast. The promise of a pension for injury was less compelling to the man who was already rich. Zheng Shi's system was designed for collective survival and growth. It was less adept at managing the psychological fallout of its own unprecedented achievement. Whispers started in the shadowy spaces between ships. They spoke of Zhang Bao's deserved supremacy, of the burdensome nature of the widow's rules, of opportunities missed due to caution. The most potent symbol of her control, the harsh, uniform punishment, became a flashpoint. When one of Zhang Bao's favored captains was reportedly disciplined for transgressing the code, it was no longer seen as justice, but as a slight against the admiral's own authority. The human network of loyalties began to pull against the bureaucratic framework. Zheng Shi, the master reader of rooms, could not have missed the shift in the atmosphere. The air in council grew thicker, more charged with unspoken challenges. Deferential nods became a fraction of a second too slow. She was facing the ancient paradox of power. The very lieutenants you empower to secure your rule eventually become powerful enough to threaten it. Her response was not confrontation, but a masterclass. In political jujitsu, she began to strategically delegate, granting Zhang Bao and his inner circle greater operational freedom in certain theaters, effectively allowing them to blow off steam while keeping them within the fold of the overall confederation. She may have used personal persuasion, reminders of their shared history, and the undeniable logic of their combined strength versus a fragmented future. But the crack, once formed, could not be fully sealed. It had introduced a terrifying new variable: choice. The captains now knew in their hearts that an alternative to her totalizing rule might exist. The fleet, while still a colossal entity, began to operate with a subtle, nascent schizophrenia. A unified body with two competing heads, one strategic and one martial. The illusion of monolith was broken. This internal strain did not yet shatter her creation, but it rendered it profoundly vulnerable. It transformed the Confederation from an impregnable fortress into a complex, straining alliance. The Qing Empire, for all its might, had failed to find a weakness in her armor. Her own captains and the very human nature she had tried to codify into submission had succeeded. The question now hanging over the South China Sea was not if the empire would break her, but whether her own world, built with such flawless, brutal logic, would consume itself from the inside out. The absolute ruler now had to negotiate not with enemies, but with the simmering discontent of her own court. By 1810, the stalemate had hardened into a form of perverse, accepted reality. The Qing dragon and the pirate Leviathan were locked in a costly embrace, bleeding each other's treasuries dry. But the calculus of exhaustion favored Zheng Shi. For the empire, the conflict was a hemorrhaging ulcer on its distant southern extremity, a drain on resources and a festering insult to its celestial authority. For her, it was existence itself. Yet, within her floating kingdom, the whispers of fracture had grown into discernible rumblings. She now faced war on two fronts: the weary external pressure from the Qing and the more dangerous internal pressure from ambition and complacency. It was at this precise moment of contingent strength, still formidable but foreseeably brittle, that she engineered her greatest maneuver. The Qing envoy, a high-ranking official named Zhou Shilin, did not arrive with a fleet of warships. He came bearing the weight of the imperial bureaucracy, scrolls of possible terms, and a deep-seated cultural revulsion for the task. To negotiate with a bandit was degrading. To negotiate with a woman bandit who had been a prostitute was an almost unspeakable concession. The meeting likely took place not in a grand hall, but in a neutral, tense space, perhaps a fortified coastal residence, or even aboard a spacious junk. The atmosphere would have been thick with unspoken histories, the envoy's Confucian disdain, the guarded aggression of Zheng Shi's captains, and the keen, evaluating gaze of Zhang Bao. Zheng Shi did not approach these talks as a supplicant, but as a CEO proposing a merger. She understood the emperor's face needed saving, but she also knew the value of her assets. Her opening position was not a plea for mercy. It was a list of demands that laid bare her profound understanding of power. First and foremost, a blanket, irrevocable pardon for herself, for Zhang Bao, and for every man under her command. Not an amnesty that could be later revoked, but a full restoration of legal standing. This was non-negotiable. It addressed the primal fear of every pirate, the hangman's noose waiting on shore. Her second demand was breathtaking in its audacity: the right of her organization to retain its entire accumulated wealth. The silver, the silks, the jewels, the weapons, all of it was to remain in their possession. She was not surrendering loot. She was transferring assets. This single clause transformed the negotiation from a criminal proceeding into a corporate divestment. The Qing, in their desperation for peace, were being asked to legitimize plunder. The third pillar of her terms was the most strategically brilliant. She offered the dissolution of the Pirate Confederation not into helpless obscurity, but into the arms of the state itself. Zhang Bao, along with a significant contingent of her best fighters and ships, would be inducted directly into the Qing Imperial Navy. They would receive ranks, salaries, and legitimate commands. This served multiple purposes. It provided a glorious, face-saving exit for the warrior faction loyal to Zhang Bao, channeling their violent energies into official service. It neutralized them as a threat to her, and transformed a rebel force into a government asset overnight. For the Qing, it was a bitter pill, but it allowed them to claim they had subsumed the pirate threat, turning its fiercest elements to their own use. Finally, for those not joining the Navy, and for herself, she secured the right to retire in peace. She would exchange her fleet for a ledger, her sovereignty for a vast legal fortune. The negotiations were a complex dance. Zhou Shilin likely bristled, threatened the resurgence of full-scale military campaigns, and appealed to her supposed desire for social redemption. But Zheng Shi held the stronger cards. She could point to the unbroken string of naval defeats, the drained provincial coffers, and the simmering discontent along the coast. More subtly, she might have allowed the envoy to perceive the cracks within her own organization, hinting that if a deal was not struck now, the resulting chaos would unleash 100 unmanageable splinter gangs, a problem far worse than a single negotiable entity. The agreement they finally reached, the Yaking Emperor's pardon of 1810, stands as one of the most favorable surrender documents in history. She achieved every single one of her objectives. The fleet was dissolved, but on her terms. The pirates laid down their arms, but they walked away richer and more secure than they had ever dreamed. Zhang Bao received the rank of lieutenant colonel and a legitimate military future. And Zheng Shi, she secured the only thing she had ever fought for since her days in the brothel: absolute, unassailable security. She had taken a life of relentless vulnerability, and through a quarter-century of impossible grit and cunning, bartered it for an inviolable contract. She didn't just make peace. She conducted a hostile takeover of her own destiny, using the Empire's seal to notarize her victory. The woman who had been a piece of property had just negotiated the purchase of her own freedom, and that of 80,000 men. with the down payment paid years before in terror and blood. The silence that followed the signing was not the silence of defeat, but the profound, echoing quiet of a checkmate delivered with a smile. The true measure of Zheng Shi's victory was not in the thunderous salutes of a surrendering fleet, but in the profound, almost deafening quiet that followed. Overnight, the architect of the most fearsome maritime force in the world simply stepped off the deck. She exchanged the rolling horizon for the fixed geometry of a wealthy urban compound, likely in the bustling, anonymous port of Guangzhou. The woman who had commanded the wind now commanded a household. The red battle banners were carefully folded away, replaced by the subtle, expensive silks of a respectable matron. This transition was her final and perhaps most cunning masterpiece of reinvention. Her wealth, protected by imperial decree, was staggering. It was not merely a chest of plundered coins, but a diversified portfolio. She invested in legitimate shipping ventures, property, and the lifeblood of southern China, the gambling trade. With imperial connections secured through the pardon, she established a sprawling, opulent gambling house. This was not a retreat. It was a lateral move into a different kind of empire. The gambling den became her new flagship. Here, the same principles that governed her fleet found a peaceful, profitable expression. Order, calculated risk, and the management of volatile human nature were still the currencies of the day. Former pirates, now guards or patrons, mingled with Qing officials and merchants in the smoky rooms. She presided not with a cutlass, but with a ledger, her authority unquestioned because her influence was now woven into the very fabric of local commerce and corruption. The sense of control remained absolute. Merely the theater had changed. Her personal life, long subsumed by the demands of command, reemerged in this new stability. She raised a son, likely adopted from within the Zhang or Zheng lineage, named Zhang Yulin, with the resources of a queen and the focused ambition of a stage mother. She guided him not into piracy, but into the ultimate bastion of Qing legitimacy, the imperial civil service. The boy studied classics, practiced calligraphy, and was groomed to pass the arduous imperial examinations. This was the final, exquisite twist of her strategy. The son of the pirate queen would become a scholar official, his success a permanent shield for the family, and the ultimate laundering of their name into social respectability. Her legacy would be protected not by cannons, but by a mandarin's robe. Zhang Bao, her former right hand, embarked on his own surreal journey through the Qing bureaucracy. Honoring the treaty, he served with a mix of distinction and simmering ambition. He was promoted, even receiving a minor noble title, and participated in campaigns against other pirates and rebels. The former terror of the South China Sea now hunted on behalf of the emperor who had once vowed to destroy him. Yet the old instincts never fully left. In 1822, he was implicated in a plot, a vague whisper of conspiracy that speaks to a lifelong rebel's difficulty conforming to any system not his own. He died under mysterious circumstances soon after, possibly executed, possibly a victim of political intrigue. His death was a quiet coda to a thunderous life, a reminder that the empire she had outmaneuvered could still be a dangerous partner. Through all this, Zheng Shi endured. She witnessed the Opium Wars, saw British gunships impose a new kind of chaos upon the waters she once ruled. and watched the Qing dynasty begin its slow, terminal unraveling. She lived to see her son, Zhang Yulin, achieve the impossible dream. He passed his exams, entered the civil service, and was appointed as a magistrate in the prosperous province of Yunnan. A child raised in the shadow of pirate junks was now a representative of imperial authority, collecting taxes and settling disputes hundreds of miles inland. Her triumph was now complete, institutionalized, and safe. She died in 1844 at the age of around 69 in her own bed. The cause was likely illness, not violence. Her obituary, had one been published, would have been a masterpiece of selective memory. A wealthy widow, a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother to a government official. The 6 decades of terror, the revolutionary social codes, the humbling of an empire, all of it receded into rumor, into the ghost stories fishermen told on the dark water. Her ending is what makes her story so psychologically compelling. She did not die in battle, a martyr to a cause. She did not fade into penniless obscurity, betrayed by her own. She engineered a soft landing of unimaginable gentleness after a life of unimaginable hardness. She obtained the one thing her brutalized childhood had denied her: a secure, respected, and quiet old age, surrounded by the tangible proof of her own cunning. The pirate queen became a grandmother, her fiercest battles fought over chessboards and loan agreements, her empire reduced to a house built, beam by beam, with silver that had once been carried on ships she commanded. In the end, she didn't just beat the system, she retired from it, leaving it to manage the world she had so profoundly altered. The story of Zheng Shi resists easy categorization. To label her merely a pirate is to call a cathedral a pile of stones. It mistakes the material for the profound architecture built upon it. Our investigation reveals a figure who operated on a different philosophical plane entirely. She was a supreme institutionalist in a world of anarchists, a bureaucrat of the outlaw world, a CEO whose boardroom was the deck of a warship. Her genius was not in violence, but in the meticulous channeling of violence into systems that created stability, loyalty, and staggering profit. She looked at the chaotic, self-consuming nature of piracy and saw a design flaw, which she corrected with a written constitution. What makes her legacy so destabilizing to our historical imagination is the utter comprehensibility of her motives. This is not a myth shrouded in supernatural ambition or romantic rebellion. It is a case study in applied intelligence. Every action, from her strategic marriage to her brutal code to her negotiated retirement, stems from a core driving imperative: the absolute negation of vulnerability. Having been reduced to a commodity by her society, she spent a lifetime building a structure so formidable that she could never be commoditized again. She didn't seek to become an emperor. She sought to make emperors negotiate with her as an equal. In this, she succeeded completely. Her story ultimately inverts our traditional narratives of power. She did not conquer a throne. She manufactured a throne from the fabric of the sea itself, weaving together human desperation, economic incentive, and brutal law. And then, in her final masterstroke, she dismantled that throne and sold the materials back to the original owners at a monumental profit, securing a legacy of legitimate comfort. She understood that true power is not the unwillingness to surrender, but the ability to choose the terms of your own surrender. Terms so advantageous they constitute a quieter, more durable form of victory. So the verdict of this investigation is clear. Zheng Shi stands as one of history's most formidable organizational and political minds. She forces us to expand our understanding of where statecraft can occur, not just in palaces, but in the liminal spaces of the marginalized, forged in the crucible of necessity. She demonstrates that the most revolutionary act can sometimes be the imposition of order, and that the ultimate power lies not in defying the system, but in understanding its mechanics so intimately that you can, for a time, become its architect, and then its most fortunate retiree. Her tale is not just one of a pirate queen, but a timeless lesson on the nature of resilience, the architecture of influence, and the quiet, relentless work of rewriting one's own destiny from a script of despair into an epic of calculated triumph.